Christian calendar, the month of September marks the season of creation. Spanning from the first Sunday in September to the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals and ecology, on October 4th. It's a time during the church year to reflect and engage with the wonder, the wisdom, and the inherent goodness of creation. In New England, this season also coincides with the gathering and the harvesting in, as our growing season comes to an end and we celebrate the fruits and vegetables that we grow in our region. This celebration of the season of creation brings together a variety of different Christian denominations. Official recognition of the season of creation began in 1989 with the Eastern Orthodox Church, but it was also endorsed by the World Council of Churches, the Lutheran World Federation, Christian Aid, the Anglican Communion Environmental Network, and the Global Catholic Climate Movement, just to name a few. And since then, Methodists, Presbyterians, and the United Church of Christ have also committed to celebrating this season. We, as American Baptists, also honor the season of creation. One of the earliest American Baptist advocates for creation was the Reverend Dipsy Morikawa. It has been said that Morikawa was the most dynamic and brilliant leader the American Baptists ever had. In preparation for Earth Day 2021, Good Faith Media published a piece about Morikawa, written by Aaron Weaver. After being rejected from missionary service because of his Japanese heritage, Morikawa served 3 Japanese-American congregations in Los Angeles, following his ordination in 1937. Then he and his wife spent 2 years in an internment camp in Arizona. Before serving the First Baptist Church of Chicago for 13 years, and then he served as the Director of Evangelism for the American Baptist Churches USA. Morikawa had a new approach to evangelism. Instead of focusing on individual salvation, he encouraged the denomination to consider what communal salvation might look like. He said, "We have obscured the gospel, distorted the gospel by assuming that evangelism was primarily and fundamentally winning souls to Christ and saving them from eternal perdition." He went on, "We have missed out on the larger horizon of the redemption of the cosmos, the restoration of all of God's universe." Morikawa is considered the father of Baptist environmentalism. He and his colleagues coined the term eco-justice. This stance on evangelism, however, created tension among American Baptists, and he was named a heretic. But something of his evangelistic approach remained. And in June of 1989, the Board of General Ministries of the American Baptist Churches unanimously adopted a policy statement on ecology and ecological situational analysis. This policy statement called for all American Baptists to take 8 steps, including affirming the beauty of God's creation, learning the environmental dangers facing the planet, and exerting their individual influence in shaping public policy, insisting that industries, businesses, farmers, and consumers relate to the environment in ways that are sensible, healthy, and protective of its integrity. Morikawa and these policy statements adopted by the denomination connected the 2 books of our faith in their approach to reconciling humans with creation and God's abundant love, grace and salvation. It's the book of Scripture and the book of creation. There has been a long understanding in Christian tradition that the book of Scripture and the book of creation can coexist equally with one another and reveal God to us equally. We can learn about God both through the book of Scripture and through the book of creation. and the author of our psalm today, Psalm 19, also valued these two books and structured their writing in this manner, first addressing the book of creation and then addressing the book of Scripture or of law. These first 6 verses of the psalm reveal God's glory in all of creation. They express how the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Day to day, the earth pours out speech, and night to night declares knowledge. This speech and knowledge is not heard, and yet both the speech and the knowledge go out to the ends of the world. God has placed a tent for the sun, and the sun runs its course, touching everything on earth with its heat and its joy. And then the psalmist transitions to God's glory in the law, the Torah, the Holy Scriptures, writing, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple." And culminating with, "More to be desired are they," God's laws, "than gold, sweeter also than honey and drippings of the honeycomb." The psalmist concludes this poem with words that are very familiar to many of us. "May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." Many times we hear this uttered as the preacher begins their sermon on Sunday morning. This sentence, too, is holding together the book of creation and the book of Scripture or law. As the psalmist writes of the meditations of their heart and calls God their rock, and then the psalmist writes about the words of their mouth and calls God their redeemer. Notice also here the shift from a third-person narration to a first-person confession and commitment. Using first-person pronouns in the last verse, the psalmist places themselves in the midst of both creation and the law, and invites us, every time we read it, creating a way to step into being. In a faithful world between both books, creation and the law. Faithfulness to the law, Presbyterian pastor and author Ruth Bowling writes, is not a matter of social conformity through adherence to a set of rules. It is rather, she says, a way of being in the world that holds God dear. And perhaps when we hold God dear, we also hold God's beloved creation dear and God's beloved law dear. In the 4th century, the deserts of Egypt, Persia, Palestine, and Arabia were filled with men and women known to us today as the desert Ammas and Abbas, or mothers and fathers. Early Christian leaders who retreated from cities to the desert. In his book, The Wisdom of the Desert Sayings of the Desert Fathers of the 4th century, Thomas Merton not only collects these sayings of men and women that have been passed down, but he also explains why they were in the desert in the first place. Merton writes that these men and women were the first Christian hermit who abandoned the cities to live in solitude. Why did they do this? Well, Merton goes on, the reasons were many and various, but they can be summed up in one word, as the quest for salvation. In those days, Merton explains, people had become keenly conscious of the strictly individual character of salvation. These desert fathers and mothers were not trying to dismiss the law of God. They did not like the way that those in authority were manipulating God's law, and they believed that it could be more expansive. So they chose to retreat to the expansiveness of the desert, to reflect and to read both the book of creation and the book of law. While they were in the desert, they also acted as spiritual directors and would impart wisdom on those who visited them. Those bits of wisdom included many stories about how to live in community with one another, how and why we should seek to encounter God. Eventually, the oral tradition of the desert islands and Abbas was written down so that we have it today. These monks had a way of being in a world that held God dear. They valued both God's glory in creation and in the law. One saying of St. Anthony goes like this. A certain philosopher asked St. Anthony, "Father, how can you be so happy when you are deprived of the consolation of books?" Anthony replied, "My book, O philosopher, is the nature of created things. And any time I want to read the words of God, the book is before me." St. Anthony, and I would suppose his colleagues in the desert as well, understood that salvation was bigger than just one person being reconciled to God's love. Salvation, they believed, was also for nature and creation to be restored and reconciled to God's love as well. Anthony, much like Jitsu Morikawa and today's psalmist, sensed God's presence in creation and believed that it could just as much teach him about God as the written law did. It was and is just as worthy of salvation as humans are. Perhaps Anthony understood that the law of God gets more attention than God's creation, sometimes exclusively so. And perhaps retreating to the desert into God's creation was St. Anthony's way of balancing the two books that God has restored to us. Maybe God's law makes more sense in the context of God's creation, and vice versa. Both are important in order for us to have a full relationship with God. I think sometimes it might be easier for us to lean towards the book of the law. We spend time in scripture and worship service and Bible studies and personal devotionals. And our lives in general have pivoted, focusing more on indoor activities, working in offices, spending free time in shopping centers, and having access to home entertainment. We may not be naturally inclined to linger outside of God's creation, but perhaps church leaders over the centuries, from the author of the 19th Psalm, the St. Anthony of the Desert, to American Baptist Jitsu Morikawa, they come alongside us to remind us that God has left us two treasure troves, two books that glorify God, leading us to ponder the wonder, the wisdom, and the inherent goodness of both. And so may we, 21st century American Baptists, seek God's wisdom and presence in both books.